Yesterday, I went to Brooklyn to pick up the Torah that I had finished. Right now, they're working on the checking my 10th Torah, but this was the ninth Torah I picked up, Baruch Hashem. So I'm always fascinated by the parts of the Torah which have scribal oddities or scribal distinctions, scribal differences. So in that context, I wanted to talk about the backward nuns, which appears on chapter 10, verse 35. So first we'll read these verses, then I'll go to the source, then we'll read some of the commentaries. It says, there's a backward nun on the beginning of at beginning of verse 35. There's a break in the Torah, and then you draw an upside down and backwards nun, although there's a lot of debate how to draw it. And then it says, Vayihi Vinso Aaron Vayomer Moshe. When the ark traveled, Moshe spoke, Kuma Hashem, arise, Hashem, V'yafutzu oivecha, let your enemies be scattered, V'yanusu misanecha mipanecha, let your enemies flee from before you. Uvenuchol Yomar, and when the ark would rest, Shuva Hashem, Revivos Alpha Yisrael, and when the ark would rest, Moshe would say, Shuva Hashem, Revivos Alpha Yisrael, reside Hashem amongst the myriads and thousands of Israel. So before we read the Rashi, we note that there's a backward nun before it and after it. So what's the basis for this? We'll get to the Rashi in a moment. But we go to the text of Tractate Shabbos, the chapter that's called Kol Kisvei HaKodesh. That's the name of the 16th chapter of Tractate Makos. And if you go to the bottom of 115b in Tractate Shabbos, I'll read to you what it says. There's Tana Rabbanan, the Braisa taught, the source taught, quoting our verse, Vayihi Vinso Aaron Vayomer Moshe. Right. And when the ark traveled, Moses said, and interjects the Gemara on the basis of this verse. Also, HaKadosh Baruch Hu simanios milamala ulamata. God made signs above this section, above and below. Now, it doesn't say here exactly what the signs are. It just says God made signs here. And let me just finish the text. Well, Mar is to teach us she'ein zeh mikoma, that this is not its place. We'll see what that means. Rebbe taught, Lo min Hashem hu zeh. That's not the reason why we have these signs. Ela mipnei sefer chashiv hu b'fnei atzmo. That the only reason why it has these signs is because it's a book in and of itself. Let me just pause for a second. Oh, excuse me. And let me reiterate what this is saying, but I'll say it in maybe plainer speak. There is these two verses, which are some of the most famous verses in the Torah, because we sing them every time we take out the Torah and when we put back the Torah. When we take out the Torah, we say, Vayihi Vinso Aaron, and when we put it back, we say, Uvenuchol Yomar. So before these two verses appear in the Torah, the Talmud says here that Moshe made, or God made signs before the verses and after the verses. Why did he make the sign? Why are there signs? Now, we had identified these signs based upon the way our Torah is written. I had explained to you that it's a backward nun. Now, it doesn't say that in this passage. We'll see where that comes from. But why do we have these signs here? So the Talmud offers two explanations. The first explanation, which is the anonymous opinion in the text of the Talmud, is that it's because they indicate that this is not the place for it. What does that mean? We'll see in a second. The second approach is to indicate that this is actually a separate book of the Bible, that there are not 5 books of the Bible, but there are 7 books of the Bible. That the book of Numbers actually consists of 3 sacred quote unquote books. And there are halachos, there is reason why we need to know if it's a separate book in and of itself. There are practical halachic reasons, but aside from that, this is the debate. The first opinion is because this is not the place, and the second opinion is because this is a separate book. And if you really look at the book of Bamidbar, the first part of the book of Bamidbar of Numbers is totally different in tone than the last part of the book. The last part is about the different sins of the Jewish people, whereas the first part is more about their formation before they started to travel. And the last part of the book is after they started to travel, they made a series of sins and the narrative from that point on. So that's, on a simple level, why perhaps we might look at it as 2 different books, the beginning of Bamidbar and the end of Bamidbar. What about the opinion that says that this is not its place? So Rashi says, what do you mean that this is not its place? Rashi on the Talmud says, because it really doesn't fit here. Because now they've started to travel. So why is it here? It should have really been written amongst the formation. But so if that's the case, why was it written here? The reason why it was written here, the Gemara is going to explain why it's written here, even though it's not its place. So we'll continue with the text of the Gemara. So the Talmud continues. Now, we still haven't said anything about backwards nuns, and we'll have to see how we get to that point. Kaman Azla Hada Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Whom does this position go? And Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Chatzva Amudah Shiva, that it says in Proverbs, wisdom built her house, and it hewed out a pillar of 7. What's this pillar of 7? Elu Shiva Sifrei Torah. This refers to the 7 books of the Torah, meaning to say God built the world in wisdom. And he hewed out pillars, which are the 7 pillars of the Torah. So we see that there are 7 books of the Torah. This is the source for it. Also, actually, the beginning of our portion refers to the 7 branches of the candelabrum. But here we see that these are the 7 books of the Torah. So who is this idea like that says that there are actually 7 books of the Torah? This is like Rebbe, who says that the reason why this is marked out, these 2 verses are marked out, is because they're actually a book in and of themselves. Mantana de Poagale Rebbe. So the Gemara asks the question, who is the author, who is the opinion that argues with Rebbe, that says that the reason why there are signs, and not because it's its own book, but to demonstrate that this is not really the proper place for it. That's the position of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. The Tanya Rabbi Shimon Gamliel taught, Atida Parsha Zu Sheti'akar Mikan V'tichta Bimkoma. In the future, these 2 verses will be lifted up from here and returned to their proper context. So if that's the case, why are they written here? Kedei lahavsik bein paranos rishona or paranos shnia. In order to cause there to be a gap between the first punishment or first bad thing that happened prior to these verses and the second bad thing which happened after these verses. So in the future, when the Yetzer Hara, when the evil inclination will be nullified and the punishments will be nullified, and we won't worry about punishments, it will be written in its place. Meaning to say that the previous paragraph was talking about that they traveled 3 days in the wilderness. and which was a sin, because as we'll see, that the sin was that they traveled like children leaving like leaving school, that they ran away from Sinai. And after these two verses, it says that the people began to complain. So if these two verses would be written together, then the prosecuting angel could come up to heaven and say, your children have sinned, sin after sin. And that would be very bad. Also, the one who's reading it will be so upset that the evil inclination could cause our ancestors to sin time after time, and therefore he'll be concerned about himself. How am I ever going to refrain from sinning? But in the future, where there will be no Satan, then you won't have to cause a separation, and then even Aaron will be returned to its proper place. So the Gemara asks the question, what is the second punishment? The second punishment, or the second bad incident, that is when it immediately follows these verses. It says the people began to complain. And so therefore, they began to complain. What was their complaint? They said, we're so tired after these 3 days of travel. We didn't rest from this difficult journey. And what was the initial sin? The initial sin was they traveled from the mountain of God. And Rabbi Chaim Bar Chanina said that this means shesaru me'acharei Hashem. That those 3 days they began their journey. They began their sinful desires, that they had no food, and they began to challenge God. But the Ramban disagrees with that approach, and he cites the approach that Tosos says here. Tosos here says, Rashi says that they began to ask for meat during those first 3 days, whereas the Re says no. The first was what the Midrash says, that they traveled from Sinai a 3-day journey like a child leaving school who is running. He can't wait to get out of school. The bell has rung. It's recess period, and he runs away from the last day of school. That's how they would run from Mount Sinai. For 3 days they ran because they were studying a lot of Torah at Sinai, and God said, this is a terrible thing that they did, so we can't put these two passages together, so we'll break them up in between. So this is the text of the Talmud. We have a few questions remaining, which is, first of all, why should there be this book in and of itself, its own book? Well, hopefully you get to that. Number two, the second major question is, where we still don't know what these signs are supposed to look like. So those are the two major questions. I want to just say one other thing. But before we get to continuing the Talmud a little bit, we'll come back to those two questions in a moment. But first, I see a question from Bruce. So the Talmud continues. It says, Ibayalu hagilyonin. The gilyonin is like the margins, the empty space on the parchment of the Sefer Torah. Matzilon otan me'adleko ein matzilon otan me'adleko. Let's say there's a fire on Shabbat, and you could save the margins of the Torah. Are you allowed to save that on Shabbat? So the Gemara says, Tashma, Sefer Torah Sheboa. Let's say there's a Sefer Torah that the letters began to fade. If you could collect 85 letters from the whole book, which is the amount of a book, one of the smallest books of the Torah, then Matzilin, we save the Torah on Shabbat. We can even go into the fire on Shabbat and save the Torah and carry it out. Otherwise, we don't save it. So the Talmud says, if that's the case, why, if there are not 85 letters, why do we need 85 letters? Why don't you just save it on account of the margin? So the Talmud gives an answer. No, the case of where it faded is different. But what's the source of this idea of 85 letters? The Talmud continues. A Torah scroll which was erased. If you could collect 85 letters, like the passage of Vayi ben Saharon, you save it. So we see from here, the basic point is that this 85 letters that are in these two verses, they are the minimum size of a book of the Torah. And if it's that amount, then you could save it on Shabbat. Otherwise, you'd have to be concerned not to save it on Shabbat because it would lead to a violation of Shabbat. So I want to say two things about, first is, I guess like streams of consciousness, but the first is somebody sent me an article last week about there was a Chabad in Long Island. I don't know if any of you have saw this. I think this was in the New York Post. There was a Chabad in Long Island where there was a fire, tragically, in the synagogue. And the firefighter happened to be Jewish, and he ran into the fire to save the Torah scroll. And the rabbi was very effusive in his praise, and he said, saving a Torah scroll is like saving a life. So I am not criticizing the firefighter, because the firefighter acted on instinct and out of passion, and he didn't ask a question. I'm not even criticizing the rabbi, because he probably wanted to build up this firefighter and express his gratitude if the person did this heroic thing. But I want to be very clear that saving a Torah scroll is not the equivalent of saving a life. You can't even compare it. And in fact, one should not risk their life to save a Torah scroll. It's against, even though a Torah scroll is the holiest object, ritual item, it's just that. It's an object. It's not the equivalent of a life. And one should not risk their life to save the Torah scroll. That being the case, there have been many examples in Jewish history where people went beyond the law to save a Torah scroll because it just represented everything about why we live. And because it represented everything about why we live, the people, without asking the halacha question, went out of their way to save the Torah scroll. I also want to mention, since we're talking about fires on Long Island, I don't know if people heard about this attack that happened in the Long Island today. Did anybody hear about that? So let me just share with you that here, let me just read it to you so you can read it. That it says there was a car explosion early this morning at 3 a.m. in the Five Towns, which is Long Island. And the young Israel of Hewlett released now I was once the rabbi there at the Young Israel of Hewlett. Like for a summer, I was what's called a Rabbi Woken. When I was a rabbinical student, I went to served at that synagogue. I served at that synagogue. And they said that Avi's auto repair shop was torched when a tow truck on the lot was set ablaze. ASAP Restoration, located across the street, these are all Jewish blocks, had its windows smashed. And the Israel Chesed Center, where my mother-in-law is the head volunteer, had a banner tied to its front gate with anti-Semitic graffiti. So basically, and the graffiti said 50,000 dead Gazan kids or something like that. So basically, this is the world today where there's every day another major anti-Semitic attack. And so we pray to Hashem, and we will advocate fiercely to protect the Jewish community. Okay, so going back to this passage, I wanted to say we still have to address two things. What is it about these verses that makes them significant in and of themselves as a holy book? But before we get to that question, we have the earlier question, which is, what is the sign? What is the sign that was supposed to be done before and after? So spoiler alert, we we know from our text of the Torah that we rule that we make a backwards nun, an upside down backwards nun. Where does that come from? So Rashi, to the Talmud, not in the Torah portion and not in the text in Shabbat, but to the text in Tractate Rosh Hashanah 17b, explains that the point was to make this backwards nun, and Rashi there draws this upside down nun, and that also appears in an early midrash called the Psikta Zutarta, and the Maharsha writes that and the Maharsha also mentions that idea. So the Maharshal writes, however, the Maharshal, who's the Maharshal? He's the 16th century. So from Rashi and the Maharsha, we see the idea that you're supposed to draw a backwards nun. Rashi's writing in the 11th century, Maharsha in the 15th century, but in the 16th century, Maharshal, Rabbi Shlomo Luria, writes that if you write a backwards nun in the Torah in this manner, it's disqualified because you've written two extra letters that are not needed. You can't write an extra letter in the Torah. And he says you're disqualifying the Torah if you do that. We do that to this day. We rule you're supposed to do it. But he would say if you did that, it's a disqualified Torah. Can you imagine that? There's 304,805 letters. And if you write these two extra letters, you've disqualified the entire Torah. And so according to Maharshal, he says that these markers just means that you're supposed to leave a space between these paragraphs before and after it. So that's the Maharshal's approach. You're just supposed to leave a space. There's actually, hold on one second. There's actually many other commentaries on this passage. What you're supposed to do. Hold on one second. So the Sifri says that the approach is that you're supposed to make dots, above and below. And so this sounds like what you're supposed to be doing is that before you begin the paragraph, you just make a dot, and afterwards you make another dot. There's a whole other discussion here. What does this backwards nun look like? So the Zohar writes that you're not supposed to add on a backwards nun beforehand or afterwards, but when you write the nun of the word Vayhi ben Soah and the nun of the word Mitonanim, that you're supposed to turn those nunin upside down. And some say that you're supposed to turn upside down the nun of Venucho. So there was not a lot of consensus about this in the medieval times, but today I've never seen a Torah that doesn't have it with the backwards nun before and after. Okay, so why did they make these? And this will be the last thing about the Nunan, and then we'll go back to the discussion about these two verses in general. What's the reason why the mark was made specifically with a backwards nun? So Rabbeinu Bechaya writes that this passage should have been written by the flags, because it says there, "V'nasa'o moed machaneh halaviyim b'toch hamachanos," that the Ol Moed, the tent, traveled in the Levi camp amongst the camps, because the ark was in the Ol Moed, and that's where it should have been written. So therefore, God made the nun backwards to show that it's supposed to be backwards, not here, but in the beginning. And there are 50 paragraphs from the verse V'nasa al Moed until Vayhi ben Soah. So if you count up the paragraphs in the book of Bamidbar, from the beginning until here, you'll count 50 paragraph breaks. And that's why there's this nun to tell us that this passage should be found 50 paragraphs earlier. The Maharsha gives a different answer. He says the nun hints to punishments, because we know that in the Ashrei prayer, in the Ashrei Psalm, it says in the Talmud in Brachot 4b that Ashrei, the letter nun, is missing from the acrostic, because that the letter nun is associated with nefila, with falling, with having been punished, and so therefore we flipped that's why the nun was supposed to be written, but we flipped the nun to, so to speak, say we're flipping the bad to the good, the falling to the good. And Maharsha also writes that the reason why the letter nun is written is because it's to indicate that this is a book on its own. Because this book, this Sefer, is a book which is the smallest of all the books, and it only has 2 verses. And the letter nun comes to hint to the fact that these 2 verses contain the 50 gates of understanding. And the reason why we'll go back to that in a moment. And the reason why they are flipped over is to hint to the fact that the 50 gates of understanding are too difficult for us to understand, and we couldn't follow them. And so therefore, even Moshe, who is the greatest of the prophets who's mentioned in these verses, only understood 49 faces of God, but not the 50th. So what does this mean? It means, Maharsha is saying that they were actually supposed to be, this entire book of the Torah was given as a whole book, but it was too difficult for us to understand. And even Moshe couldn't understand it. So the book was given in condensed form, and we'll see what that means, because based upon the Behaalotecha, that the book hints to the fact that it was part of a much larger book. And really, the book contained many more letters, but since it was so difficult for us to understand, we couldn't achieve the 50th level of understanding, which is symbolized by the upside down nun. For this reason, we only have 85 letters from it, but not the full text. The Chodesh Aviv comes to tell us, and this is something that Bruce raised, that the nunin that are flipped up, they come to hint about the phrase Naaseh v'nishma, where the Bnei Yisrael said, we will do and we will hear. And when they ran away from Sinai, they flipped over that expression. There it goes to answer what Bruce was asking about before. He was right on the money. So, okay, so now we get to the question here, which is, what is it about this paragraph? What is it about this paragraph? So about that, I want to turn to the Behaalotecha. The Behaalotecha says like this. The Behaalotecha. Okay, the Behaalotecha says like this. He says like this. He says, okay, it says in the verse, the pasuk Vayihi ben Soah, the Behaalotecha states, in the first verse of these 2 paragraphs, it says Vayihi ben Soah, Aaron, there are 12 words. There are 12 words. And this corresponds to the same number of words that appear in the verse L'kol Hayad HaChazakah. Anybody know where that verse is? That's the last verse of the Torah. So the last verse of the Torah has 12 words, and this first verse here has 12 words. And in the second verse here, Uvenucha Yomar Shuva Hashem Revivot Alpha Yisrael. There are 7 words in that verse. And this corresponds to the same number of words as in the verse Bereshit bara Elokim. Excuse me. Et Hashemayim ve'et haaretz. So there are 12 words corresponding to the last verse of the Torah. And there are 7 words in the other verse in this short book corresponding to the first verse of the Torah. Moreover, the portion, this paragraph begins hold on one second. Hold on. So the paragraph begins with a vav and concludes with a lamed. It says Vayhi ben Soharon, and it concludes with Alfei Yisrael. So the letters of Lo, recalling the verse Halichaut Olam Lo, the ways of the world are His. So anyway, the Behaalotecha is also indicating the fact that Behaalotecha is indicating the fact that by the fact that there are the same number of words in this verse, which are in the first verse of the Torah and the last verse of the Torah, it's hinting to the fact that this book is a small book in and of itself. It's one of the books of the Torah. And then the Behaalotecha says, Kol parsha sheyesh ba kedei l'laket Pei Hey Otiot, and quotes the text of the Talmud, which we were discussing before. Any paragraph which has 85 letters, any paragraph, any passage of the Torah, which we can gather 85 letters, which is the same number of letters in these 2 verses, we can save from a fire on Shabbos. So we'll see. Let me read what they say here in the footnote, but before we get to that, he says, that's why this paragraph of the Torah is placed next to the next paragraph, which says that a fire burnt amongst them. It says, Vativar bam eish, fire burnt amongst them. To tell you that we can save a passage of the Torah that has 85 letters from the fire. And also circumcision, which the numerical value of the word circumcision is 85. 85, Mila is 85. Circumcision saved you from the judgment of Gehenna, from the judgment of hell. Just before we go to the 85 letters, let me explain. They have a beautiful footnote here which explains the idea of saving this Torah scroll from the fire on Shabbos. Transporting or carrying objects from a public domain to a private domain on Shabbos is prohibited unless there is an Erev, which we have here in DC. But since the prohibition sometimes is a rabbinic prohibition, when it's a rabbinic prohibition, the sages waived that rabbinic prohibition under certain circumstances, where normally we would be prohibited to carry something. If it's a rabbinic prohibition to carry, then there are certain cases where the prohibition is waived. So when there's a Torah scroll which has at least 85 letters in it and threatened by fire, so we could save the Torah scroll and even carry it in a place where it's only a rabbinic prohibition. So that's what's going on here, and that's the source for this idea. Okay, so let me just summarize what we said up until this point. Basically, we've established that there's this unusual paragraph, and this paragraph is supposed to be marked out. And we said, why is this paragraph, Vayibin Saron, marked out differently? Because it's marked out differently because two theories. One theory was because it's a book in and of itself. That's the position of Rebbe. And Rebbe Shimon Gamliel's position is to say we needed to break up the paragraphs of punishment that there right before this was a bad sin that the Jewish people made, and right after this is a bad sin. Well, we know what after the sin was right after this. That was that the people complained to God. But what was the sin beforehand? So Rashi says the sin beforehand was that they were starting to desire meat. But Tosfos says the sin was that they were too eager to run away from Mount Sinai. And that's based upon the Midrash. Then, in addition to this, we learn, well, why is this a book in and of itself? So the Marsha and the Behaalotecha, and also I didn't mention it, but the Chida, say that there was actually a whole nother book of the Bible, which was the highest level of the book of the Bible, of all the books, the most symbolic and secretive in its revelation of God. And that was the 50th level of understanding, as symbolized by the letter Nun. But because we were not able to receive it, and Moshe Rabbeinu himself was not able to understand it, therefore we were just given a snippet of this 50th of this book, which is the 7th book of the Torah, which contains this deep discussion of God, and we were just given this snippet, which is the first verse and the last verse of it. And that's hinted to by the fact that it's the same number of letter of words as the first verse in the Torah and the last verse in the Torah. In addition to that, the Behaalotecha says there's another hint to this idea. And the other hint to this idea is that we know that on Shabbos itself, you're not allowed to carry anything, except you can carry something if the prohibition of carrying in that specific case is only rabbinic. Sometimes the prohibition is biblical. Depending on where you are, it can also be rabbinic. So if it's a rabbinic prohibition and then there's a Torah scroll, then the rabbis allowed you to carry the Torah scroll to safety. What's the definition of a Torah scroll? Let's say the Torah scroll began to disintegrate, because the life of a Torah scroll doesn't last forever. Let's say it began to disintegrate. Then you can take, as long as the Torah scroll has 85 letters, and that's then it's considered to be enough to save it. And those 85 letters are based on the fact that this passage of the Torah, these two verses, which are a book in and of themselves, have 85 letters. Okay, so let me just pause for a second. Anybody make questions? Okay, so now that we've given like a general introduction to this verse, I wanted to say, let me just read the Rashi's explanation of it so we're aware of Rashi, and then we could actually understand this verse when it's read when we sing it on Shabbat. Did you have a question, Elaine? Okay, so it says, Kuma Hashem, arise, God. Lefisha haya makdim lifneihem. Why does it say arise, God? Why did Moshe say when the ark would travel? Why would he say arise, Hashem? Because the ark would go ahead of them by a 3-day journey, and Moshe would say, Amod v'amtein lanu. Moshe would tell the ark to stop, wait for us. Do not go too far away. So the ark was traveling too fast for the Jewish people. And Moshe had to say, Kuma, which is an expression of stop and wait for us. So when you say, Vayibin Saron, when the ark traveled, Vayomer Moshe was saying, stop, wait for us. V'yafutzu oivecha. Let those who are your enemies, who are gathered upon us, let them be scattered. V'yanusu misanecha. Let those who hate you run away. Elo harofim. These are those who pursue. Basically, Moshe says that one group should be scattered and the other group, and the and that another should run away. The afuto of one should be scattered, and others should run away. So Rashi is saying that the prayer to scatter applies to those who gather to attack, but the prayer to flee applies to those who are already in pursuit of Bnei Israel. The misanecha, those who hate you. This refers to those who hate Israel. Shekoanos hasoneet Israel. Whoever hates Israel, this is our lesson of the day. We see all this anti-Semitism now. Rashi says, whoever hates Israel hates the one who spoke and the world was brought into being. As it says, Umisanecha nastu rosh. Those who hate you have raised their head. And who are they? Against your nation they conspire secretly. So whoever hates Israel, Rashi says, hates the one, really hates God. And then it says, Shuva Hashem, reside tranquilly Hashem. The word Shuva does not, normally Shuva means return, but here it means to live tranquilly. Menachem translates it as Margoa, tranquility. Finally, the last verse, Revavos, Alpha Israel, rest Hashem amongst the myriads, the thousands of Israel. Magid she'ena shorabi Israel, pechute mishnei alafim u'shtei revavos. So the divine presence only rests will not rest fully if there are less than 2,002 myriads, and a myriad is 10,000. So you need a minimum of 22,000 in order for the divine presence to rest. Okay, this is just our discussion of these two verses of Vayibitz Aaron and Uvnu Chayomar. Okay, we'll stop here. If anybody has any questions, happy to address.